Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. I am Vrinda Sahai, research analyst in the Security Studies program at Carnegie India. As India assumes the BRICS presidency in 2026, the bloc stands at a moment of consolidation and quiet recalibration. Building on Brazil's pragmatic chairship in 2025, India has sought to reframe the BRICS around a renewed emphasis on building for resilience, innovation, cooperation, and sustainability, anchored in a people-centric and humanity-first vision. This episode explores how India is balancing continuity with ambition as BRICS navigates mounting pressures from renewed US tariff measures, intra-bloc trade considerations, and questions surrounding the future role and credibility of the new development bank. Joining us today is Dr. Ana Garcia. Dr. Garcia is the Associate Professor at the Institute of International Relations at PUC Rio, General Coordinator of the BRICS Policy Center, and Professor of the Graduate Program in Social Sciences at the Federal Rural University of Rio de Janeiro. She completed her PhD in International Relations from the Institute of International Relations at PUC Rio and Masters in Political Science from Free University Berlin. Dr. Garcia, welcome to Interpreting India.
It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today.
Thank you. I would just like to begin with getting a sense of what the BRICS Policy Center does. What is your role and how does the center inform BRICS policy?
The BRICS Policy Center is a research and policy center linked to the International Relations Institute of the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro. It is active since the beginning of BRICS itself, so it kind of followed BRICS throughout its history and its path. The center was founded together with the City Hall of Rio de Janeiro in 2010. So the center is now 16 years old. And the intention in the beginning was to monitor, follow, and also influence BRICS in its original 5 members. We also received several fellows from BRICS countries, researchers, academics from the BRICS countries to our center in Rio de Janeiro. We had meetings, seminars, activities, policy briefs, all of in different topics around BRICS, environment, urban issues, trade and investments, security issues, etc. The center then followed also the different developments around BRICS throughout these years, even in those years when BRICS was not so much in the headlines of all the media and the attention in the West. The center changed a little bit also the focus in a few years, trying to reach the interests around China-US tensions and these issues around, the changes in the world. And then since, I would say 2022, the BRICS Policy Center was very much required to talk again about BRICS after the expansion and the discussion around the use of local currencies, so that the BRICS Policy Center was again very centered in internal BRICS issues. I was the general director of the BRICS Policy Center between 2021 and 2023. Now I'm a senior researcher and a coordinator of the working group on the political economy of South-South relations. So I deal with trade, investments, and cooperation between BRICS and Africa, BRICS, Latin America, together with my colleague who is now the head of the center, Marta Fernandez.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining the role of the center. And I think that sets me nicely into my first question, which is just an understanding of the BRICS presidency by Brazil in 2025. In my understanding, that was more focused on trade facilitation, climate cooperation, public health initiatives, and Brazil also sort of deliberately sidestepped the de-dollarization conversation in 2025. So I would like to understand, how do you characterize it and what were the major sort of key mechanisms, major takeaways from that presidency?
So let's look a little bit back into Brazil's role in BRICS. Brazil was a founding member together with India back then in the context of the global financial crisis in 2008. Normally, there are different approaches on when do BRICS start as a group. Some people refer to the hegemonial intention to point to financial markets in 2001. But normally, we see BRICS as a political and economic cooperation group from the mid 2000s on. But I normally point, that's my analysis, to the beginning of BRICS as a group in the context of a response to the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Because what really brought this group of countries to work together was the intention to reform the international financial architecture, global governance in general, because Brazil and India are very keen in the reform of the UN Security Council, but as a common agenda of BRICS back then and still today, is the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly the IMF. And that was a very peculiar moment because the crisis hit the United States first and then was extended through Europe and then the rest of the world. And these very different countries came together with the common agenda, which was the minimum agenda back then, to demand more voting power, more voice, and more representation within the existing institutions. So the conversation was never to build a very new institution just to discard the old ones, but to reform them so that they would represent a more balanced world with the participation of those emerging economies. And Brazil was then the second presidency of BRICS in 2010 and continued that agenda. Then Brazil had the presidency in 2014, and that was a key year because that was when the new development bank and the CRA, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, was both of them were signed, like not really built because that was only 2 years later, but that was when it was announced that the bank and the CRA would be built in the next few years. So the main institution, the common institution of BRICS was then signed under Brazil's presidency in 2014. Then Brazil had the presidency during the Bolsonaro government a few years ago in 2019. And that was a very new context because then we had already tensions between US and China. Bolsonaro, our former president, was very aligned with Donald Trump, differently than the previous president. So that was a more low profile presidency. Not many things were reached in that year. Not many, there was no ambitious agenda in that year. Things were calmed down. And right after that, we faced the pandemic. So Brazil took up the presidency of the BRICS then 5 years later, last year, 2025, with a new approach. The attempt was to resume the reformist agenda of BRICS from the beginning. Two things were very important. One is that BRICS took place between two global events in Brazil, G20 in 2024 and COP30 in the second half of 2025. And that was something that pressured BRICS within two global agendas. Brazil was, as India was very involved in the G20 presidency. India was very involved in its G20 presidency in 2023. And that same was in 2024 in Brazil. We must say that even like the Brazilian civil society was very involved in the G20 agenda. And that civil society in Brazil expected also to participate a lot in the BRICS agenda and COP30 in the next year, something that did not take place in the same way because President Lula organized a G20 social so that civil society would participate in the G20, and not really like the same took place in BRICS. But COP30, yes, there was a sort of civil society common place called the people-centric summit around COP30. But back to BRICS, that pressured BRICS within two major events. And that had the bilateral effect that BRICS was too short. So the summit took place in the middle of 2025. So between G20 in November 2024 and July 2025, there was very little time to advance a very ambitious agenda that came from the Russian presidency in the previous year. But that said, the Brazilian government tried to link the BRICS agenda with the G20 and COP30. And this was very clear when you read all the declarations of BRICS in July of 2025. The language of the G20 was kind of reflected in the declarations of BRICS. Never we had three different declarations in the finance track of BRICS. We had the declaration of the governors of central banks and finance ministers, okay, but we had a specific declaration on the IMF reform, a specific declaration on taxation, and that was the first time. And we must recall that taxation was a major agenda for Brazil during the G20 presidency because Brazil wanted to discuss the proposal of taxation of ultra high net worth individuals or super rich, which was pointed in the G20 declarations for further discussion, but was there. That was also there in the Kazan Declaration of 2024. And then in 2025, Brazil had a specific declaration. But this one on taxation was to support the UN Convention on Tax Cooperation, which is a major agenda for developing countries and civil society organizations, because they say the OECD agreement on taxation is not enough to tax big multinationals and high net worth individuals, because the OECD is a limited space for that. We need to put that discussion of taxation in the UN so that more countries participate, particularly those from the global south. So Brazil and BRICS supported that agenda. We had a specific declaration on climate finance, and that reflected a lot of the G20 language on public-private partnerships, blended finance. They need to leverage and scale up resources for climate finance. And that was a sort of continuation of G20 and a link to COP30. But that was the so-called the good part. But the bad part, in my view, was that we were not able to advance enough, particularly in the monetary financial area, because that was a key agenda for the Russian presidency. The Russian presidency really focused a lot on the issue of interbanking infrastructure, clearing compensation in local currencies, trade facilitation and trade finance in local currencies, the proposal of creation of a reinsurance company, many things that are really, really ambitious for BRICS. It is on the way of trying to have more alternative currencies on the side of the US dollars, because everyone knows that it is not easy to de-dollarize from one day to another without hurting our own economies, because we have our reserves and we have our economies based in the US dollar, even China. So how can we move forward in alternatives slowly and step by step without damaging and without confronting directly the United States? So Russia had a lot of proposals on that because Russia was pressured under sanctions. And Brazil, in my view, was not able to move forward enough. It pointed to the continuations of discussions, to the continuations of studying those agendas, but there was nothing that came out that really moved forward. And one of the things that Brazil could have, in my view, moved faster forward is the implementation of the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Because the Contingent Reserve Arrangement is a BRICS mechanism signed in 2014 together with the bank. But it never took off. It was never really implemented. It is still under test. It's the 8th and 9th test now. And what Brazil said, and the first, Brazil did not want to confront directly Donald Trump. Trump was back to power in January 2025. And Brazil was very careful in not, having a very strong radical agenda, to slow down and try to not call too much attention. And that in the end did not work. because tariffs imposed on Brazil and on India was of 50%. Now India reached a trade deal, but Brazil did not yet reach a trade deal. South Africa was hit by 30% tariffs. So, the moderate language that Brazil used correctly in some ways did not turn out the way that Brazilian government wanted. But yet, what Brazil said was, let's put this agenda and the CRA agenda on the technical level, and let's put that for discussion for the central banks. So the Ministry of Finance, we would, interrogate them. What about the CRA? How much have you moved forward? They say, well, that's not our topic. This is the central bank's agenda. So they put that in a very technical level. And yet, this did not work so fast. And when Brazil closed the BRICS presidency in December last year, it just moved forward to India to say, now you are the one to discuss that. And the CRA is supposed to be a sort of alternative to the International Monetary Fund in a way that it could be used from BRICS countries when in needed of a crisis of balance of payment, when in need of extra resources. But it's very linked to the IMF itself. Countries can borrow up to 30% on the treaty. It said that countries can borrow up to 30%. The rest, they have to move to the IMF. The IMF remains as a supervisor of the disbursements and the actions that the CRA could have. And the currency to be used is still US dollars. So the idea was to revisit the treaty and reform it before it starts, to use more local currencies as currencies for disbursements, and to detach it more from the IMF supervision. So that is a true BRICS institution, true BRICS mechanisms. And that is the agenda now that I think that India could really make a difference. For us who study BRICS for several years, more than a decade, India could really make a difference if it's able to put the CRA to work for the first time.
Thank you for laying that out quite so clearly. And it also gives a bit of a direction on what exactly is the baton that's being passed on from Brazil to India. And, India has made this rebranding bid, but there's also that burden of carrying on the legacy and maintaining the continuity that went on, in the past year. Because you're right in saying India and Brazil they're quite in similar positions when taking on over the BRICS presidencies. So thank you for laying that out. And so speaking specifically of what you just mentioned, the trade in national currencies that's been in conversation for a while now. This is somewhat driven or maybe part of, or just a different name for the de-dollarization drive that we just more recently we're not mentioning the term de-dollarization, but there are alternate methods, as you mentioned, that are in discussion amongst the BRICS members. How would you say that this trade in national currencies or local currency engagement is being strengthened within the bloc? So how does intra-bloc trade actually serve this purpose? Is it through, for example, last year, the statement that came out about dismantling export controls amongst the BRICS members? How do you analyze this and how do you see that going forward?
So first of all, intra-BRICS trade is trade between BRICS countries and China mainly. If you accept India from that, because India is always a different case, all BRICS countries, from the original ones to the expanded ones, are particularly dependent on China for foreign trade. It's amazing. Like Brazil is South Africa is absolutely dependent on China. China is the main trading partner for Brazil and South Africa. For Russia, I think now it became after the war in Ukraine. With India, again, it's a different issue. India has actually a trade deficit with China, whereas the other countries have a trade surplus. And I have analyzed last year and compared the new BRICS members with the original ones in trading with China. And the pattern is more and less the same. If you take Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, the Emirates, and now Indonesia, they all are very China-centric in terms of trades. So if you take out China, intra-BRICS trade is very little. And this is something that we need to advance. We need to move beyond, let's say that beyond China in terms of foreign trade. But beyond the volume of trade centered in China is also the content of trade. For instance, Brazil to 70% is concentrated in soybeans and iron ore. South Africa is a little bit more diversified, but all primary products from coal to agricultural products. Russia is gas and oil. If you take, of course, Iran, Egypt is mainly oil. Ethiopia is a little bit more diversified, but all agricultural products. And even Indonesia is 60% of Indonesia's trade to China is oil. So it's highly concentrated in energy and natural resources. And the other way around, what China exports to those countries are high technological products. So that you have a division of labor, the traditional one, on trade with China, that is something that China is very aware of, that in the long run, this could be a problem, because you reinforce the role of the BRICS members and developing countries as, exporters of only primary goods. And the main challenge for us is to reindustrialize in a time of the, digitalization, AI, and highly technological products, very concentrated in the US and China. So trade is something that is central for BRICS. Brazil was right in the decision of having one of its priority in trade facilitation. On the one hand, to respond to increasing trade protectionism that was, even before tariffs in July 2025, already a big topic for the new Trump government. But actually, it was also a way to try to skip tensions with the U.S. and put it in a more, light conversation, because trade facilitation is a consensus among everyone. Everyone wants to have more trade facilitation to debureaucratize and to facilitate. But trade facilitation is not actually currency. It's legislation, transparency, all sorts of bureaucratic technical issues that you can do, trade agreements, all technical issues that you can do to increase trade, to put less tariffs, to put less barriers, and still use the US dollar for trade finance. And that is what actually takes place now. Trade within BRICS is still very dollarized. The BRICS countries, they use the US dollar still as a reserve currency and a trade currency. But it is sort of the way that BRICS is trying to find is to compensate in local currencies for trade financing and for reserves. Also, credit is something that China is particularly using. China is very careful in that too. China is testing the use of the renminbi bilaterally with many countries. We had that in Argentina. We had that with other countries. China is testing the use of the renminbi, for instance, as one of the IMF currency and the currency base. China is trying to use the ways and the infrastructures that are existent now to test the use of the renminbi as an international currency in a way that in the long run, the renminbi could eventually substitute the US dollars. And the third area is the disbursements of the New Development Bank. The New Development Bank last grand strategy was to increase the use of local currencies until 30% now by the end of this year. It's still very limited. The last report of 2024 that we have access to points that only $2 billion equals to $2 billion were used in local currencies, the renminbi and the rand, the South African currency, not in Brazilian currency, not in Russian currencies, still not in the Indian currency that is supposed to take place this year, now in March. So we are about to see the disbursement in the Indian currency. But it's still limited. The intention is to reach 30% of disbursements in local currency. The next strategy should be more ambitious than that. And I think that is the way of trying to move forward in a slow way, but a secure way at the same time, because everyone is very careful on what could happen. Donald Trump has threatened the BRICS of even higher tariffs if they want to de-dollarize. And as the world is now moving to more tensions, BRICS wants to be more pragmatic and more careful. I think that's the way, at least, that India and Brazil deal with that.
So speaking of the US tariff pressure, we've spoken about it briefly now, so maybe we'll just elaborate on it a little bit, is how does this US tariff pressure essentially impact or make the BRICS countries change or, adjust their economic agenda? So yes, like you mentioned, there's more and more scrutiny coming from that side. There's individually, the US has imposed high reciprocal tariffs on each of these countries. And collectively, as the BRICS grouping also, there's been quite a lot of scrutiny expressed from the US. So how would you say that is playing into, BRICS response in the economic forum?
So BRICS was hit not as a group, but individually, each country, right, by tariffs. It's very interesting, very curious to see that, for instance, China and Russia, as they have more bargaining power with the US, they have this more geopolitical weight within BRICS. They did not suffer the same way as India and Brazil and South Africa have. We were hit much harder than those Eastern powers, so to say. And then the new BRICS members, the smaller countries that joined BRICS recently, they were, as some of them still seen as developing countries, they were hit even less. Like Indonesia already reached a deal with the US, but Egypt, Ethiopia, they were hit by 10, 15%. So on the very basis of what Donald Trump wanted. But Brazil and India were hit really, really hard by 50%. And Brazil was even worse because the US wanted to intervene in domestic politics by trying to influence the result of the trial against ex-president Bolsonaro for an attempt of trying to promote a coup d'etat in Brazil. So the US wanted to actually intervene with these mechanisms of tariffs, the result of a trial. And that was really, really badly seen in Brazil. That was a major issue here. President Lula was clever not to try to, reach out to Trump right away, but waited. So as did President Modi. Modi went to China. Those two countries, those two leaders were clever in a way to say, no, not with us. We're not going to now, go on our knees and pledge for a reduction of tariffs. We want to be treated respectfully. We don't let you intervene in our internal affairs. That was President Lula. So sovereignty was really strong. The U.S. government had to push back in a few tariffs around a few products from the Brazilian economy because the U.S. market is dependent on those exports. Partial airplanes, partial manufacturing, oil, and a few other products. But for instance, coffee is still under a lot of tariffs. Modi was able to now negotiate a trade deal with the U.S. And I think that Brazil is next because Lula is now going in March to Washington. And one of the main topics will be this negotiation. One thing is that people expect, let me go to this point that I think is important. Many people expect a lot from BRICS, and we need to calibrate that. People are very optimistic, excited about BRICS as an alternative, multipolar world, an alternative agenda for the global south. BRICS has this power of attracting a lot of attention from the developing world to say, well, here's, a group that we can trust after the non-alignment movement. Again, now we have an alternative from the global south to confront the traditional powers, Europe, US, and Japan. But, this expectation, which is on the one hand true, BRICS is important in this world today. BRICS is important for the global south. It's really important that BRICS exists in this world today. But on the other hand, let's calibrate our expectations about what BRICS can really do. And BRICS was not able to have a common, coherent response to world's problems in many occasions. Let's go back to the pandemic. BRICS did not have a coherent common approach, for instance, to the pandemic. If you take on the side the disbursements from the New Development Bank, which was very important, that each BRICS members received, a big disbursement in order to confront the disease. That was very important. But there was no common agenda in terms of developing a vaccine or helping each other. Everyone looked back to its own necessities. Everyone has its own research and development for its own vaccine. So the geopolitics of vaccine and vaccine access. India and South Africa were together in the WTO for a vaccine waiver. And Brazil, China, and Russia stepped back. So why could BRICS not have a common approach for, let's put that, humanity-centric, people-centric BRICS to confront, for instance, the COVID-19 disease? Now, a common response to the tariffs. We could not have that. Everyone developed its own agenda, and Lula called a meeting from BRICS countries. So the presidents met online to discuss the tariffs right after the July summit. But in terms of concrete actions, what can we see? Do we have a common approach, for instance, to, for climate finance, to combat climate change? Do we have a common approach, to discuss and to help the humanitarian crisis in Gaza? No, we didn't. So let's calibrate our expectation about what BRICS can do, what BRICS cannot do. And I think that is something that we need to pay attention to. I think that Brazil and India are very close when it comes to the BRICS agenda as a more pragmatic one. Brazil was very central in not saying BRICS is an anti-West group. The government was really speaking out that BRICS is not to be seen as an anti-West group, anti-Western. So we need peace. We need a balanced world. We just want more representation. So what I said at the beginning was interesting. The result, in my view, from the BRICS presidency in Brazil was a bit of going back to the original BRICS agenda to reform, global governance. I think that BRICS moved, not BRICS itself alone, but as a response to the world, as the world was polarizing more and more, as the U.S. is polarizing more and more against China, BRICS was moving slowly from 2016, 14, I would say slowly to be a more geopolitical group, to have a more geopolitical weight. Not that each country does not have its own agenda. They do. They are still focusing on the reform of the international financial institutions. But as a group, BRICS has a geopolitical weight in the world order today. And I think that Brazil and India want to kind of picture or profile BRICS back as a reformist group.
Thank you for laying that out. I want to go back and touch upon the New Development Bank that we've been speaking about. You mentioned that, there is this target of 30% financing in the local members' currency is a target of the bank. There is also concerns or general talk of expanding the credit base of the bank. So I think presently or in the beginning, it stands at $100 billion. But is this really a concern that will stop the initial, as you mentioned, the original agenda is the alternative that the BRICS wants to present? Is the credit base being smaller than, of course, other multilateral financial institutions? How much of a challenge is that, and how are the BRICS countries, looking to address this?
So the NDB is a very interesting institution for us to look at because on the one hand, it is a BRICS institution. It is to be seen as one. It is founded by the BRICS members originally, but it's not the same as BRICS. And that gets confused for most of the public, journalists in general, because they see the NDB as the same of BRICS, and it's not really the same. On the one hand, the NDB is a financial institution in the financial market today. So it wants to have credibility. That was why, for instance, in 2022, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, the NDB halted disbursements to Russia, not to suffer sanctions from other financial institutions. Now it's back there. I think it's financing again projects in Russia, but at the beginning it froze the disbursements to Russia, fearing that it could be hit by sanctions as well. So it is a financial institutions in the financial market. On the other hand, the NDB members are not exactly the same of the BRICS members. You have Uruguay, you have now Colombia wanting to join the NDB. You have Bangladesh, you have other countries that are not exactly BRICS countries, and you have BRICS countries which are not NDB members. Because the point is that when you become an NDB member, you have to disburse, you have to pay to the bank. And, take Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a highly indebted country. Ethiopia is not able to, disburse any foreign money for financial institutions. Ethiopia needs to receive money. So back to the topic that I was just saying before, the CRA is not working yet. Also, carefully, because they know that, for instance, Egypt and Ethiopia are countries which are highly indebted and could demand credit from the CRA once it's functioning. The NDB is not an institution that helps countries in balance of payment problems. It's a project-oriented institution. And again, it's not precisely the same as the BRICS members. I think the NDB plays a very important role as it is an institution able to finance, projects towards infrastructure needs and climate needs for BRICS and for member countries. And right now, actually, the NDB only finances projects for its member countries, not outside. This is also something that sometimes gets confused. People say, well, they are financing Africa. No, they're not. They can only disburse for African countries if those are members of the NDB. And right now, it is only South Africa and now Egypt. So the NDB has an important and at the same time limited role as an alternative institution. I think the focus on infrastructure and sustainable development, it's a kind of a sort of like consensus, because the World Bank has the same priorities. Other financial, local and regional development banks have also the same priorities if you take regional banks in Africa or in Latin America. So it's a kind of a consensus of the role of development banks around the world. The point is how much the NDB can really, really finance the needs of the countries and at the same time really preserve social environmental rights on the grounds, on the territories. I have participated with the BRICS Policy Center, for instance, in the independent evaluation through the independent evaluation office of the NDB of a few projects that were financed by the NDB in Brazil. And we had, for instance, a big wind plant that was financed in the north of Brazil, which is good. It's renewable energy. At the same time, it had a lot of impacts in the local population. So we had to speak that out. We have to put that for the bank, and the bank is now more aware of how to implement a project respecting the local traditions, the local communities, the local environment, and not just come with a major agenda to be implemented and period. So this is something that the bank needs to work and improve in the disbursements that it had already in the past and for the future. I think the independent evaluation office of the bank plays an important role in that manner.
Thank you. Thank you so much for clarifying that. I want to move now to specifically the Indian presidency and priorities for this particular year. So, and there's a lot to unpack on the BRICS on this particular year itself. But the first thing that I want to ask you is about the expansion of membership in the BRICS. So India particularly has not been very keen on that, and it's been quite evident, whether that is because there's a struggle to balance the West versus the BRICS for India. That is definitely one of the points. But how do you see that? And I do also want to touch upon the fact that Iran's membership in 2024 has been under a lot of scrutiny. There's been contention about that since 2 years. The US comes into play again here because they've threatened sanctions for countries trading with Iran and encouraging that sort of position for Iran, especially under the BRICS. So how do you see that, and how do other BRICS member countries sort of expect India to continue this balance that it's trying to have with the Western BRICS?
Yeah, the expansion of BRICS was not a consensus in 2022, 2023, precisely because Brazil and India were not really willing to expand BRICS. On the one hand, out of fear that their own power within BRICS could, be hit by expanded membership. On the other hand, because of the discussion around, expanding, but for whom? Who should join BRICS under what criteria? And that was never really clear for anyone. I was following very closely the expansion process in 2023. As I was a director of the BRICS Policy Center, I was there in Johannesburg, and it was really curious. Like, no one knew. It was already clear Brazil and India were ceding to Russia and China, particularly China. But now who? And, overnight, these discussions were going on, and then everyone was informed by, in the morning by President Ramaphosa, this, membership that was really not really clear for everybody. So Russia wanted Iran, China wanted Emirates, Ethiopia, etc. And Brazil invited Argentina back then before the election of President Javier Milei, because President Fernandez, who was before that was president of Argentina, was very close to the Lula government. So Brazil invited Argentina. Few months later, there was election and Javier Milei won, and Javier Milei said, no, we don't want to join BRICS. We are too much aligned to Donald Trump in the US. So the expansion process was never all the way through a process. Criteria are still not very clear, so that I would say it's a very political process. The way that Russia found out in 2024 was very interesting, to build this middle layer of strategic partners. So it included several partners in this middle layers of strategic partnerships, without also really saying, okay, if you're a strategic partner now, what do we do? What are the criteria that you need to fulfill in order to be part of BRICS, and when? This is still not clear today. What happened then last year was that Brazil negotiated and won in bringing Indonesia to BRICS. Indonesia is a G20 member, so Brazil looked and said Indonesia was also is a middle power as well, and in Asia is also a country that is a bridge between East and West. So for Brazil, Indonesia's participation is a key had a key role in the non-alignment movement. So Indonesia was very important for Brazil to say, we are not against expansion, but we need to look exactly who, is that a problem or is that a solution to BRICS, right? So Indonesia finally became a full member in 2025, and no one else. There was this conversation around Colombia because there's a lack of South American representation in BRICS. But in the end, Colombia was not invited. Colombia was invited to join the new development bank. And I think that India follows more or less the same path as Brazil, to be more careful in not accelerating the expansion process. On the one hand, because it's really hard to find consensus. It was already hard to find consensus among 5. It's even harder to find consensus among now the 10 full members, because Saudi Arabia is halfway in, halfway out. I was speaking to a person within the finance ministry, and he was telling me, I don't consider, I am even careful to pass on information around BRICS issues to Saudi Arabia, because we don't know what they're going to do with this information. Are they going to pass it over to the US? Are they keeping that? So there is a bit of confusion about the role of Saudi Arabia. So if you don't count Saudi Arabia, you have 10 full members today. It's already very hard, and you're pointing to the issue around Iran, to find consensus around those around those 10 members. And we saw that last year when Iran was attacked by Israel and then the US. I was saying, oh my God, I'm going to be very frank to you. I saw the G7 meeting in Canada, and the G7 members applauding the attacks on Iran. And I was saying, the president of Germany is saying they're doing the hard job for us. And I was very angry. I said, what is the BRICS response to that? Because it's a BRICS member being attacked. And you see the G7 applauding that. So what is BRICS going to do? And then I made all the contacts in the government saying, is there going to be a response? And they were telling me it's really hard. In the end, few days later, they had a common declaration defending Iran. Okay, a declaration. It's good. It's perfect. But there is a difficulty, in saying, what are we going to do? If there is a war in Iran, you're going to have a war with another BRICS member besides Russia. What are we going to do? Let's recall 2022, when BRICS was also not able to, build a group of moderation and peace negotiations with Russia to try to stop that. So, there's a lot of difficulties in building a common strategy around critical issues in the world for BRICS. Trade facilitation is kind of easy in comparison to security issues. So I think that there's a lot of, I have more questions than answers to the Indian presidency, because it's still in the very beginning area now to see what the Indian government will do, and are now building the linkages of think tanks, academics, and also civil society organizations. But I think that the tendency is that India halts this process of expansion now, because it needs to consolidate now the new BRICS group. The BRICS Plus is a new group. It's a new BRICS. It's not the BRICS as we know. And this is something that needs to be first consolidated before a further expansion.
Thank you. And I would like to close out with this last question. We've been speaking of the return to the original BRICS agendas and, things like those. Looking at the present geopolitical situations, there's a lot happening regarding Gaza peace efforts. There's a lot happening with US withdrawal from multilateral bodies, the tariff wars, all of those situations. Keeping them in mind, what kind of challenges do you see for India in furthering the South-South cooperation that is the original sort of, BRICS agenda with which it came to be formed? That is something that has never been out of context for this particular grouping, and definitely India would want to carry that forward. But what challenges do you see in this particular context?
I think this is the major challenge. The tensions between the US and China are, imposing a lot of tensions on BRICS, particularly for those countries which, as Brazil and India, do not want to explicitly confront the US. India is different than Brazil in a way, because India is more, and this has been shown now in the last few months, also more capable of dealing and playing out this, the Indian strategy of multi-alignment is really strong, right? Brazil tries to do the same, but is not as successful as India. India is I would say at least India is very successful in playing out the game and bargaining with the multiple poles of power and really getting the best out of those negotiations. India has a strong bargaining power. I think that for India's BRICS presidency, a major challenge will be what I said in the beginning, to really implement the financial and monetary infrastructure to advance the use of local currencies, which is something that is not so much. There is a lot of tensions within India around this issue. I don't think that India is very clear, as Russia was for obvious reasons, in advancing a lot the use of local currencies. But it is there. India is already discussing that. I think that India is also capable of moving forward that agenda in a careful way. I think that the trade issue will come up again because, again, all countries are impacted. Trade protectionism is very strong. And BRICS needs to move beyond China and trade facilitation among BRICS each other without China would be a major advancement for BRICS countries. And again, if you see the priority on development issues, resilience, etc., you would put climate in the center of this agenda. Climate finance. India was very strong in the discussion around adaptation in COP30. So I think that President Modi will continue the discussion around financing of climate adaptation in BRICS countries. One issue that I didn't touch in our conversation is health. And Brazil put that in the priority last year. And Brazil built a coalition to combat socially determined diseases, which means those diseases which are very important for developing countries and hit the poor population more than the rich population is in our country. So Brazil and India have a history in cooperating in health. Brazil and India had this very important cooperation in the WTO in the end of the 1990s to fight for the flexibilization of intellectual property rights in anti-HIV medicines. So I think this could be something that India could have as a priority as well. Vaccination, the vaccine laboratories and research and development together in health. That would be something that could really, really be strong under India's presidency, that I think that would dialogue directly with President Modi's priorities. But again, we are still to see how that is going to develop. And I hope, this is my last point, that India does not make the same mistake as Brazil to have a very short, very brief BRICS presidency, because BRICS is a complex group, has complex issues. So we really need a year for discussions and advancements. And if you have only a few months, as Brazil had, we cannot move forward as much as we need to.
Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right in saying this is a complex grouping, and even to unpack that could take us hours. But thank you so much, Dr. Garcia, for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this topic. It was really a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure too. And I hope that we can continue this discussion along this year.
Absolutely. Thank you. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on X, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.